With the recent Star Wars infused month filled with a new ride, The Mandalorian, and the upcoming final movie to the Skywalker saga, it seems like the best time to talk about LucasArts. It has been a great publisher and developer in the past, and gave us some of the most classic Star Wars games ever made. Nowadays though, EA is mostly in charge of Star Wars games. But why? Well, let's find out. 5 years after Star Wars and its sequel hit theaters, it was pretty evident that George Lucas had totally struck gold. As some of you may already know, Lucas was really smart with his profits off of his creation. For example, he took the licensing rights for merchandise for Star Wars before the rights to Star Wars were purchased. And as we know, in the 80s, it was very popular to make video games based off of movies, especially after the NES was released. So Lucas took his current division, called the Lucasfilm Computer Division, and transformed it into the Game Group, which used to be labeled as Lucasfilm Games, while another department took the Graphics Group and transformed it into Pixar later on. Unfortunately, the group couldn't make Star Wars games because Atari held the rights to publish them, so the first few games from Lucasfilm Games were all original ideas like Fell+lsr in 1984, although Mania Mansion would be the first game that Lucasfilm Games had developed and published themselves in 1987. In 1990, the entirety of the Lucas company was being reorganized, which meant Lucas Games now would be a part of LucasArts. LucasArts even had their own magazine that same year talking about upcoming games and interviewing the developers. In 1993, LucasArts finally would be able to release a Star Wars game called Star Wars X-Wing, which was an X-Wing simulator basically. Later that year, they would also release another successful Star Wars game called Rebel Assault. As the gaming market shifted into the first-person shooter games with help of Doom, LucasArts would release Star Wars Dark Forces in 1995. The game spawned a new series of games called the Jedi Knight games. As we transitioned into the 2000s, LucasArts said in 2002 that the overabundance of Star Wars games being released was reducing the quality due to the amount of them being developed. LucasArts also wanted to focus on making original content as well. So from then on, 50% would be Star Wars and 50% would be non-Star Wars games. Unfortunately though, the non-Star Wars games were not seeing the success that the Star Wars games were. LucasArts' response to this was to focus more on Star Wars games. They released a game in 2003 called Knights of the Old Republic, although when its sequel, The Sith Lords, released, LucasArts was met by critics for forcing Obsidian Entertainment, the developer of Sith Lords, to release it unfinished, filled with bugs, content cutouts, and a bad ending. In 2004, LucasArts saw that it was time for a change. Their newly appointed president, Jim Ward, said that LucasArts was quite a mess. LucasArts decided to reduce the staff from 450 to 190. LucasArts had tried so many different ways to make a Star Wars game from FPS to MMORPGs, but this time in 2004 they released an open-world FPS game called Battlefront. The game went on at the time to become the best-selling Star Wars game of all time, placing them in the original trilogy DVD sets. Battlefront 2 would release in 2005. They also teamed up in 2005 with Traveler's Tales to release a LEGO Star Wars game for each episode, which eventually of course became this work of art in 2007. In 2008, The Force Unleashed would be considered the fastest selling Star Wars game at the time. President Jim Ward would leave Lucasfilm in 2008 as well, and be succeeded by Daryl Rodriguez from EA. The internals of LucasArts were once again scaled down. A year later, LucasArts would go back to a classic non-Star Wars game called Monkey Island. The game was actually pretty successful, but once again LucasArts started facing troubles in 2010. President Daryl Rodriguez would leave after only being there for 2 years, and was replaced by a developer from Epic Games called Paul McGean. A creative director at LucasArts known as Hayden Blackman behind The Force Unleashed also left, but creative director Clint Hawking from Ubisoft would join. A month after, in September of 2010, a third of Lucas staff were fired. In 2011, LucasArts got a license for the Unreal Engine 3 for a Boba Fett game called Star Wars 1313. In 2012, LucasArts released a Star Wars Kinect game, and the best way to describe it really is some unique form of art. And I'm pretty sure this is what caused the next thing to happen, which was LucasArts president Paul McGee left after only 2 years and was replaced by Kevin Parker and Guillaume Corsi. And then on October 30th of 2012, Disney and Lucasfilm announced that a deal had been made to acquire Lucasfilm. The last ever independent game to be released by LucasArts was Angry Birds Star Wars in November. By December 21st of 2012, Lucasfilm was acquired by Disney. LucasArts now was working on some unknown projects, one of which was considered an online service that would, quote, revolutionize the industry. But in March of 2013, Lucasfilm confirmed that LucasArts would cease operations and be replaced by Disney's interactive studio or by a third-party developer. All those projects mentioned were now cancelled. The staff was now reduced from 150 to just 10 inside of LucasArts, and it was being used just as a way to retain the licenses. In May, Disney would partner with EA to develop the next Star Wars game in a multi-year license deal. That year, under Disney, 2 new Star Wars games were being released, a mobile game called Tiny Death Star and Attack Squadrons. Of course, the first Star Wars game under EA was Battlefront. Fans of the game grew in excitement of this, of course, because it's Battlefront and it has a great reputation. Although it was a fairly solid game that visually looked incredible because, well, it's EA, fans were disappointed though to find that there was no campaign in the game. Fans also felt that the game lacked some form of depth and felt extremely non-complex. It felt a lot more for casual gamers, and EA actually said that this was true. They said they wanted it to appeal to a younger audience as well as those who are not as familiar with first-person shooters. That holiday season, GameStop claimed that Battlefront's sales were actually bad. EA took this criticism and tried making a better Battlefront, which of course would be Battlefront 2 in 2017. Although it did fix some problems like having a campaign as well as containing free DLC, EA still needed to find a way to make money if it wasn't going to be from a DLC. So they went to what they know best, which of course was loot boxes. And as we all know, that didn't actually work out really well for them. Those who purchased loot boxes had an advantage over those who didn't. Because of this, EA had a huge backlash with the microtransactions and eventually changed them to being cosmetic based only. But over time though, lately after this, it seems like the backlash for Battlefront 2 died down a little bit. And this especially happened after Respawn and EA released Jedi Fallen Order in 2019. This single player based Star Wars game actually received good reviews from critics and gamers alike. Although in EA's hands, their games have not been as successful as Star Wars games have been under LucasArts. Although an earlier report from this year said that Disney was happy working with EA, and EA's contract with Disney does expire in 2024. But this doesn't mean that Disney will keep EA as a partner because in 5 years a lot can change. So I guess for now we'll have to wait and see what happens to the next line of Star Wars games. Thank you guys for watching and I will see you in the next one.